Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lie on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. I never thought I'd end up here, alone, standing in the driveway of an old house with peeling paint and sagging gutters. My life packed into the trunk of a second-hand sedan. The house was cheap, suspiciously so, but after the divorce, cheap was all I could afford. A fresh start, I told myself. A quiet place to figure things out. The moving truck had already come and gone, leaving my belongings stacked in disorderly piles inside. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch, my foot sinking slightly into the weathered wood. The key turned with a reluctant click, and I pushed the door open, revealing my new home. The first thing I noticed was a smell, musty, like damp wood and something faintly metallic. The air was thick, unmoving. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting strange patterns on the warped hardwood floors. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper with character. I called it unsettling. I walked through the house, familiarizing myself with its layout. The floors creaked with every step, an old house's way of announcing my presence. The kitchen had an ancient gas stove, the kind that looked like it might still contain the ghosts of 100 burnt dinners. The living room had a stone fireplace, its hearth cracked but still grand in a way that suggested better days. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. The hallways stretched out before me, lined with doors that led to empty rooms. The master bedroom had a large window overlooking the backyard, where an old, gnarled oak tree stood like a silent guardian. I tried to shake off the creeping unease settling in my chest. It was just an old house. Old houses made noises. They had drafts, odd smells, quirks. That's all it was. I spent the rest of the day unpacking, trying to make the house feel like mine. As evening fell, I realized how quiet it was. No traffic sounds, no distant hum of neighbors' conversations. Just an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional pop of settling wood. I was just about to head to bed when there was a knock at the door. I hesitated. It was late for visitors. Peering through the peephole, I saw an elderly woman standing on my porch. She had sharp eyes, too alert for someone her age, and her thin lips pressed into a tight line. I opened the door cautiously. Can I help you?" "You moved in," she said. Her voice was raspy, like someone who had spent years smoking or whispering secrets. "Yeah, I guess I did." She glanced past me, into the house. "People don't stay here long." I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, well, I don't have many options." She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned in slightly, as if sharing something meant only for my ears. "If you start hearing things, don't ignore them." The hair on my arm stood up. "What?" She shook her head. "Never mind. Just be careful." Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the sidewalk as if she had never been there at all. I closed the door and locked it, my fingers lingering on the deadbolt. Just an old woman trying to scare the new guy, I told myself. But deep down, a small part of me wasn't so sure. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house groaned and shifted around me, like an old body adjusting to a new presence. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a sound faint but distinct. Footsteps, not the random creaks of an aging house, not the wind pushing against the walls. These were deliberate, slow, heavy, moving down the upstairs hallway, toward my bedroom. I held my breath, heart hammering against my ribs. And then, just outside my door, they stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I forced myself to move, to sit up and listen. Nothing. I was imagining things. I had to be. I turned over, pulling the blankets tighter around me. It was just the house settling, I told myself. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was standing just outside my door, listening, waiting. I woke up the next morning to sunlight spilling through the curtains, momentarily forgetting the unease from the night before. The footsteps I'd heard, or thought I'd heard, felt distant, like a bad dream I couldn't quite remember. Still, as I swung my legs over the edge of bed, I hesitated, glancing at the bedroom door. It was closed, just as I had left it. The hallway outside was quiet. No sign that anyone or anything had walked past my room in the middle of the night. Shaking off the lingering dread, I got up, showered, and made a cup of coffee. The kitchen felt normal in the morning light. The scent of freshly brewed coffee grounded me in reality. I scrolled through my phone, reading emails and half-heartedly browsing job listings. I was still unemployed, another casualty of my divorce. My ex-wife had been the planner, the responsible one. Without her, I was struggling to put my life back together. This house was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to rebuild. But something about it didn't feel right. The neighbor's warning from last night nagged at me. If you start hearing things, don't ignore them. I had almost convinced myself that she was just a nosy old woman trying to spook me, until I found the footprints. I nearly dropped my coffee when I saw them. Faint, barely visible, a trail of dusty footprints led from the hallway into the kitchen. They weren't mine. I had taken a shower, walked barefoot across the floor. My prints would have been fresh, crisp. These were old, like someone had walked through and left behind in the night. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Maybe they had been there when I moved in, and I just hadn't noticed. But they led from the hallway, from outside my bedroom door. My pulse quickened. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I was overreacting. Maybe the previous tenant had left them. Maybe it was dust shifting in the night, settling into patterns that looked like footprints. I grabbed a broom and swept them away. Out of sight, out of mind. By the afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that everything was fine. I even ventured outside, deciding to introduce myself properly to the neighborhood. Hollow Street was quiet, lined with houses that all seemed a little too old, a little too worn. The kind of place where people kept to themselves. I spotted the old woman who had knocked on my door last night, watering a small patch of flowers in her front yard. "Hey!" I called out, walking up to her fence. "I didn't catch your name last night." She turned, studying me with those sharp eyes again. "Margaret, I know who you are," she interrupted. "You're the man who moved into that house." I forced a smile. "Yeah, that's me." She sighed, setting down her watering can. "You should leave." I frowned. "Look, if you're trying to scare me, I'm trying to warn you." Something in her tone made my skin prickle. "You said people don't stay in that house long," I said. "Why?" She wiped her hands on her apron. "Because of what happened there." I folded my arms. "And what exactly did happen?" Margaret glanced toward my house, as if expecting something to be watching us. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "A long time ago, a man named Charles Whitmore built that house for his family. He was a strange man, obsessed with things he shouldn't have been." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" She hesitated, then said, "The occult, dark rituals. He believed the house was special, that it could be a door to something beyond this world." A cold weight settled in my stomach. What happened to him? Margaret's expression darkened. His wife left him. She took their son and ran in the middle of the night. The next morning, the neighbors found Whitmore standing in the middle of the street, covered in symbols he'd carved into his own skin, babbling about how he let something in and how it wouldn't leave. A chill ran down my spine. And what happened to the people who lived there after him? Margaret shook her head. Some stayed a few months. Some lasted only weeks. The last one, She ran out screaming in the middle of the night. Said she heard something whispering to her. Said she saw someone standing at the foot of her bed. I forced out a laugh, but it sounded hollow. You don't actually believe that, do you? Margaret's eyes locked onto mine. Do you? I swallowed hard. It's just an old house. Old houses make noises. Her lips pressed into a thin line. If you start hearing things, really hearing them, leave. I didn't reply. I just nodded and walked away, her warning echoing in my head. That night, I told myself I wasn't going to let an old woman's ghost stories get to me. I locked my doors, checked the windows, and got into bed. But I couldn't sleep. The house felt different at night. The air was heavier, like the walls were pressing in. The silence was too deep, too expectant, like the house itself was waiting. And then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hallway toward my room. I held my breath, my entire body tensing. Then came another sound, a whisper, low, faint, impossible to understand. But it was right outside my door. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it would shake the bed. I forced myself to move, to sit up. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone. Turning on the flashlight, the whispering stopped. I took a shaky breath and climbed out of bed. I had to check. I had to. I stepped toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Then, before I could turn it, something scratched at the wood. A long, deliberate scrape, like nails. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, my phone shaking in my hand. The scratching stopped. Silence. And then, asterisk knock. Knock, asterisk. Two slow, heavy knocks. I bolted. I ran out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and straight out the front door, not stopping until I was standing in the middle of the yard, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, its windows black and empty. I stood there, staring at it, waiting for something, asterisk, anything asterisk, to move in the darkness. But nothing did. Nothing except my own shadow, stretching long in the moonlight. And yet, even out in the open, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there in the yard, staring at the house. The cold air pressed against my skin, but I barely felt it. My heart was still hammering, my breath shallow. Two knocks, deliberate, measured. Someone had knocked on my bedroom door. I wanted to believe it had been my imagination, that maybe the house was settling or the wind had rattled something just right. But I couldn't ignore the scratching, the whispering, and I couldn't ignore the footprints from that morning. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I wasn't going to spend the night outside like some terrified child. I was an adult. I was a rational person. I just needed to prove to myself that nothing was in the house. I stepped back toward the porch, hesitated at the door, then forced myself inside. The house was still, too still. I crept through the dark, using my phone's flashlight to check every room. The hallway was empty. My bedroom door was untouched. No scratches, no marks, nothing out of place. Nothing was here. I let out a shaky breath and locked every door, every window, just to be sure. Then I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and took it to bed with me. I barely slept. By the time the sun rose, my body ached with exhaustion. Every little noise had kept me on edge. But nothing had happened after that knock. I got up and made coffee and tried to go about my morning routine as if everything was normal. But Margaret's words gnawed at me. Charles Whitmore believed the house was a door. I needed to know more. The house had come furnished with a few things from the previous owner, mostly junk. A stack of old books sat on the dusty shelves in the living room. A few boxes had been shoved into the closet under the stairs. I spent the morning digging through them. Most of it was useless. Water-stained paperbacks, a broken radio, old receipts. But at the bottom of one box, I found something different. A leather-bound journal, its edges worn and brittle with age. The name scrawled across the inside cover made my stomach tighten. Charles Whitmore. I carried it to the kitchen table and flipped to the first page. July 3rd, 1902. The house is complete. It is everything I hoped for. The architecture, The placement, everything aligns. The energy here is strong. I can feel it. August 15th, 1902. The first attempt was unsuccessful. The symbols must not have been right. I will try again. September 10th, 1902. It is working. The walls are thinner now. Sometimes, at night, I hear them whispering. They are watching, waiting. I must be careful. October 2nd, 1902. Margaret has taken Thomas and left. She does not understand. She says the house is cursed, that I am cursed. She doesn't see the beauty of it. She doesn't hear the voices like I do. November 14th, 1902. Something stepped through. I don't know what it is, but it is here. I see its shadow at night. It is watching me. I shut the journal, my fingers trembling. It was nonsense, ramblings from a man who had clearly lost his mind. And yet, I thought about the footsteps, the whispering, the knock on my door. I turned the pages carefully, scanning the next few entries. They became more frantic, more unhinged. December 5th, 1902. I made a mistake. It doesn't leave. It doesn't sleep. It is always here. December 18th, 1902. I hear it breathing in the dark. I feel it watching when I close my eyes. I should not have let it in. December 24th, 1902. It stood in the doorway last night. I did not move. It did not move, but I felt it smile. January 1st, 1903. It is inside the walls now. It is whispering my name. I cannot leave. I cannot leave. I cannot leave. A loud creak echoed through the house. I flinched, my head snapping up. The air felt wrong. Heavy, like something was listening. I closed the journal, gripping the edges tightly. My breath came in slow, controlled gulps, but my hands were shaking. The house was silent again, but I didn't feel alone. I glanced toward the hallway, toward my bedroom door. It had knocked last night. Would it knock again tonight? I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my car keys and left the house, slamming the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to shake the feeling that something was crawling beneath my skin. The town was quiet, the streets empty. Eventually, I found myself back at Margaret's house. She was outside again, sitting on her porch like she had been expecting me. "You found it, didn't you?" she said. I stopped in my tracks. Found what? Her gaze flickered to the journal clutched in my hands. His words. I swallowed hard. What happened to him? Margaret sighed. One night, he disappeared. People say he ran off into the woods, raving about how he had to escape. I clenched my jaw. And the thing in the house? She didn't answer. Instead, she said, "It doesn't like being ignored." A chill ran down my spine. I should leave, shouldn't I? I murmured. Margaret gave me a sad, knowing look. You should have never gone inside. That night, I sat in bed with the journal in my lap, debating whether to leave. I had nowhere else to go, but I couldn't stay. I had made up my mind to pack in the morning when I heard it again. The whispering, only this time it was closer, right outside my bedroom door. I clutched the journal, barely breathing. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Then, asterisk knock. Knock, asterisk. My stomach turned to ice. I squeezed my eyes shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then something changed. The air in the room shifted, grew heavier. And then, I felt it, a presence, not just outside the door, inside the room. A shadow moved in the darkness. And then, a voice, low and rasping, whispered in my ear. Asterisk, I see you. Asterisk. I lunged to the lamp, fumbling to turn it on. The room was empty. The door was still closed. But the journal had fallen to the floor, flipped open to the last page. A final entry I hadn't read before. February 10th, 1903. It is inside me now. I see with its eyes. I speak with its voice. I am not alone. I will never be alone again. I stared at the words, my breath coming fast. Then slowly, a soft knock came from the closet. 2 knocks, measured, deliberate. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so violently I could feel in my throat. That knock! It hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from inside my bedroom, from the closet. I fumbled with my keys, starting the engine, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The house loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and silent. It looked normal, just an old house, sitting in the night. But I knew better now. Something was inside, and it knew I was there. I tore out of the driveway, barely thinking about where I was going. I just needed to be anywhere but there. Margaret. I found myself back on her street, pulling up in front of her house. The porch light was on, and she was already standing at the door, as if she'd been waiting. I stepped out of the car, my breath unsteady. It knocked again. Margaret didn't look surprised. I told you, dear, it doesn't like being ignored. I swallowed. What the hell is in that house? She let out a slow sigh. Come inside. I followed her into the dimly lit living room, my pulse still racing. The walls were lined with old photos. The furniture worn but homey. The house felt safe, warm, a stark contrast to my own. Margaret motioned for me to sit, then settled into a chair across from me. You read the journal. I nodded, gripping it tightly in my lap. Charles Whitmore, he thought the house was a door. He let something in, and now it's still there. She folded her hands. Not just there. I frowned. What do you mean? Margaret's eyes darkened. It's not bound to the house. It's bound to the people who live there. A chill ran through me. That's not possible. She held my gaze. Tell me, when you left the house tonight, did you feel like you were alone? I opened my mouth to say yes, but stopped. I thought about the way the air had felt heavy in my car, the way my skin had prickled, as if something unseen was watching. I thought about the dream from my first night in the house. The whispering voice. Asterisk, I see you. Asterisk, my stomach twisted. No, I admitted, it didn't feel like I was alone. Margaret nodded. Because you weren't. The words settled deep into my bones, cold and heavy. I ran a hand through my hair. How do I stop this? How do I get rid of it? Margaret hesitated. You can leave the house. Some do, but most don't make it far before it follows. And once it's with you, it doesn't leave. A deep unease settled in my gut. You're saying I'm stuck with it? She hesitated. There might be a way. I leaned forward. Tell me. Margaret's expression darkened. You have to close the door. I didn't want to go back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drive away, to never step foot in that house again. But if Margaret was right, running wouldn't change anything. It was already with me, and I had to end this before it was too late. I returned just before dawn, the sky still thick with darkness. The house loomed ahead, its windows like hollow eyes. I hesitated at the door, my heart hammering. I stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy. A deep, suffocating silence pressed against me. I could almost feel something there, watching. I gripped the journal tighter. You want me to see you? I whispered. Fine. Show yourself. Silence. Then, a floorboard creaked behind me. I turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. Another creak. Closer this time. My breath came faster, my skin cold. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low. Breathy. Right behind me. Asterisk, I see you. Asterisk. I spun, but nothing was there. The whisper came again, this time from the bedroom. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move forward. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. The bedroom door was open, waiting. I stepped inside. The room was dark, but I could feel it. Something was there. The closet door stood slightly ajar. My pulse roared in my ears. The knock had come from inside there. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, and then the door burst open. Cold air slammed into me as the darkness inside seemed to expand, swallowing the room in an unnatural void. A figure stood in the blackness. Not quite a man. Tall, shadowed. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its smile. A deep, Unnatural hunger radiated from it. My throat tightened. The figure took a step forward. The journal in my hands burned cold, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. I tore through the pages until I found it. The last entry, the warning, asterisk. It is inside the walls now. It is whispering my name. I cannot leave. I cannot leave. Asterisk. The words were a trap, a plea, a seal that had been broken the moment I read them. I took a shaking breath and did the only thing I could. I rewrote them. Asterisk, you cannot leave. Asterisk, the air shifted. The whispering stopped. The figure hesitated. I pressed harder, dragging the pen across the page. Asterisk, you are bound to this place. Asterisk, the shadows recoiled. The figure screamed, its voice shrill and inhuman. The walls trembled, the air crackling with static. And then it was gone. The room fell silent. I gasped, sagging against the wall. The closet was empty. The air felt lighter. I had closed the door. For now. I left the house that morning, packed whatever I could fit into my car, and never looked back. I thought about burning the journal, but something told me that wouldn't change anything. The words were written. The door was shut, but I knew, deep down, that one day someone else would find it, and the knocking would start again. I didn't go far. I parked my car outside a cheap motel on the edge of town, my hands still trembling as I checked into the room. The bed was stiff, the walls thin, but it felt safe, or safer than the house. I sat on the edge of the bed, the journal in my lap. I hadn't let go of it since Margaret's house, gripping it like some kind of lifeline. The pages felt heavier now, like they held more than just words. I traced my fingers over the last passage I had written. Asterisk, you are bound to this place. Asterisk, had it really worked, or had I just made it angry? I leaned back against the headboard, exhaustion creeping into my bones. My body ached, my mind spinning. Sleep came in fits, restless, shallow. And then the whisper came. Asterisk, I see you. Asterisk. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, the motel sign outside casting faint red light through the blinds. I held my breath. Listen. Silence. I turned onto my side, gripping the pillow. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my mind was still trapped in that house. Then, a soft knock. Not at the door. At the wall. I sat up fast, my pulse spiking. The knock came again, faint but deliberate. Slow, patient. I turned toward the sound, my mouth dry. The wall was thin, separating my room from the next. Maybe it was a guess. But then the whisper came again. Asterisk, you cannot leave. Asterisk. I shot out of bed, my stomach twisting. The journal. The words. Had I really closed the door? Or had I just moved it? The knock came again, this time from the ceiling. I backed up toward the door, my breath coming fast. The air in the room had changed. Thicker, heavier. I had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I had tried to bind it to the house. But the house had never been the thing it was attached to. It was me. And now it was closer. I didn't stay in the motel. I couldn't. The knocking, the whispers, whatever was in that house had followed me. And if I stayed, I had the horrible feeling it would only get worse. So I drove. The highway stretched in front of me, an endless black ribbon cutting through the night. The air in the car was stale, heavy with something I couldn't name. I rolled the windows down, hoping the wind would clear my head. It didn't. The whispers were still there, barely audible beneath the rush of the wind. Asterisk, you cannot leave. Asterisk. I gripped the wheel tighter. My knuckles were white. I tried to drown it out with the radio, but every station was static, just crackling, empty noise, no voices, no music, just static. A cold wave of fear rolled over me. I turned the radio off, my hands shaking. The journal sat on the passenger seat, open to a page I didn't remember flipping to. A single sentence stood out, the ink darker than the rest, as if it had been written just moments ago. Asterisk, it is inside. Asterisk. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop in the middle of the highway, my chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked breaths. I turned slowly, afraid of what I would see. The back seat was empty. The air was thick, suffocating. The temperature had dropped. My breath came out in small, white puffs. Then, the rear view mirror tilted, not by itself. Something shifted behind me. Something was breathing in the dark. I didn't look. I couldn't. The door handle beside me clicked, unlocking on its own. I grabbed the journal, shoved the car into drive, and sped off. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I figured out what I had done, or what it wanted from me. The road stretched ahead of me, an empty, lifeless void under the pale glow of my headlights. I kept one hand clenched on the wheel, the other gripping the journal, so tightly my fingers ached. The cold lingered in the car, a weight pressing down on my chest. I could still hear the whispering, not out loud, inside my head. Asterisk, you cannot leave. Asterisk, I wanted to scream, to tell it to shut up, but I knew better now. Acknowledging it only made it stronger. My foot pressed harder on the gas. The speedometer climbed past 70. 80. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But then I saw it. The road ahead wasn't empty anymore. There was something standing in the middle of the highway. A tall, thin figure. No face. No features. Just a shape darker than the night itself. I swerved. The tires screeched, the car skidding sideways. My heart slammed against my ribs as I yanked the wheel, barely keeping control. The figure never moved, never flinched. It just stood there, watching. Then, the car spun out. The world flipped. My body jerked as metal crunched. Glass shattered. Pain exploded through my skull. And then, silence. I don't know how long I was out. Minutes? Hours? When I came to, the car was upside down. Blood dripped from my forehead, warm against my skin. I groaned, pain lacing every movement as I struggled to unbuckle my seatbelt. Then I heard it. The tap, tap, tap of fingers against glass. Slow, rhythmic, coming from the shattered passenger side window. My breath hitched. I turned my head. A shadow crouched there, peering in. No eyes, no mouth. Just darkness where a face should have been. Its hand pressed against the glass. Long, skeletal fingers dragged down the surface, leaving streaks of something black and oozing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it spoke, but not out loud. Inside my head. Asterisk, you brought me with you. Asterisk, a sob choked in my throat. I had tried to run, but I had never been running from it. I had been carrying it with me all along. I don't remember how I got out of the car. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the side of the road, swaying on my feet, the cold wind biting into my skin. My hands were shaking. Blood ran down my forehead, dripping onto the pavement in slow, sticky drops. The car was ruined, twisted metal, shattered glass. It should have killed me, but that thing, it let me live. I felt it watching, not just from the wreck, but from the darkness beyond the trees, from the spaces between the wind, from inside me. I couldn't run anymore. I had to go back. My body protested with every step, but I forced myself forward, hitchhiking a ride with a trucker who barely glanced at me. I must have looked half dead, but I didn't care. The highway passed in a blur. Every street sign, every turn, every mile that brought me closer to the house felt like another weight pressing down on my chest. And then, before I even realized it, I was standing at the foot of the driveway. The house loomed in front of me. The windows were dark, empty. It felt alive, breathing, pulsing. It had been waiting for me. The door was unlocked. Of course it was. I stepped inside. The air was thick, suffocating. The smell of damp wood and something rotting clung to the walls. The floor groaned under my weight, like it recognized me, like it had missed me. I gripped the journal tighter. I had thought I could escape it, that leaving the house would sever whatever connection it had to me. I was wrong. I walked deeper inside. The whispering was louder now, curling through the air like smoke. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was everywhere. Asterisk, you never left. Asterisk. I swallowed hard, stepping into the living room. The fireplace was cold, but the ashes in the hearth were disturbed. as if someone had been there recently. Then, the mirror. My reflection wasn't moving. I stopped breathing. I took a step back. The reflection stayed where it was, staring. Then, slowly, it tilted its head. Not like a normal movement, like something imitating one. A shiver ran down my spine. Then it smiled, a wide, stretching grin, full of too many teeth. My knees nearly gave out. Asterisk, you brought me back. Asterisk, the voice came from inside the mirror. The reflection stepped forward, pressing both hands against the glass. Its fingers were wrong, too long, too thin. Then the glass cracked. A long, jagged fracture split across the surface, and something black and wet leaked out. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The journal, the words, the rituals. I had tried to bind it. I had only set it free. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the floor, my body refusing to obey the frantic screams in my head telling me to run. The thing in the mirror wasn't just my reflection anymore. It was something else, something alive. The jagged cracks spread like veins across the glass, and that black, oozing liquid dripped from its surface, pooling onto the wooden floor at my feet. It reeked, a putrid, decaying stench that burned my nostrils. And then the whispering stopped, not just in my head. Everywhere, the house fell into a silence so deep, so unnatural, that it felt like the world itself had paused. Then a sound, so sharp and piercing that my entire body jolted, shattered the stillness. A knock from inside the mirror. Slow, rhythmic, 3 deliberate taps, each one vibrating through my skull like a hammer against bone. My stomach clenched. Then the knocking came again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath me. A symphony of knocking, pounding, as if something, no, many things, were trying to break through. And in the mirror, my reflection started to move. But I hadn't moved. It lifted a hand, fingers twitching unnaturally. It placed its palm flat against the glass, and the liquid seeping from the cracks spread outward, dark tendrils creeping across the surface. Then it stepped forward, not just a trick of the light, not just my mind playing tricks on me. It was coming through. I scrambled backward, my heart beat a wild, erratic drum in my chest. My hands shook as I fumbled for the journal, flipping through the pages even as the words blurred in front of my eyes. There had to be something, a way to stop this, a way to... Then I saw it, a passage I hadn't read before, a warning. Asterisk, the ritual does not bind, it does not banish, it only opens a door. Asterisk, my breath caught, my fingers clenched around the brittle pages. I hadn't sealed anything, I had only let it in. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, the walls trembled, the air crackled with something unseen, something heavy and waiting. Then the mirror shattered, a deafening explosion of glass and darkness. And something stepped out. Not me, not my reflection. Something else. Something wearing my face. But its eyes weren't human. They were empty, black, endless, and they were looking right at me. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room had changed, thick and heavy like I was drowning in something unseen. The thing that had stepped out of the mirror was me, but it wasn't. It stood there watching, its lips curled into that impossible, unnatural smile. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. Then it moved. Not like a person. Not like me. Its head jerked slightly to the side, the motion sharp, insect-like. Its fingers twitched as it took a slow step forward. The floor creaked under its weight, but the sound was off. Hollow. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't work. I felt stuck, my body refusing to obey. My pulse pounded against my skull. The house was silent again. Too silent. Even the wind outside had stopped. The world beyond the windows looked wrong, like the house had been ripped out of time, placed in some hollow, empty version of reality. And then the thing spoke. But it didn't use my voice. It was deeper, layered, like many voices speaking at once. Asterisk, you let me in. Asterisk. My mouth was dry. My hands trembled. It took another step. Asterisk, did you think you could leave? Asterisk, I tried to shake my head, tried to force words from my throat, but nothing came out. It was closer now. I could see the fine details of its face, the way its skin looked stretched too tightly over its bones, the way its pupils swallowed its irises completely. And that smile, wide, too wide, it reached out a hand. I jerked away, finally regaining control of my limbs, stumbling back until my spine hit the wall. Asterisk, you read the book. Asterisk, its voice was softer now, mocking. Asterisk, you spoke the words. Asterisk, I shook my head. No, I didn't mean to. It tilted its head, considering me. Then its smile widened. Asterisk, it doesn't matter. Asterisk, the floor trembled beneath me. The walls groaned like they were breathing. The air thickened, pressing against my skin, and I felt something moving beneath the floorboards. Something big, something alive. The knocking started again, louder, more desperate. The house was waking up. Or worse, asterisk something else asterisk was. I turned and bolted. The hallway stretched in front of me, impossibly long, like the house itself was changing, shifting. Doors that should have led outside now opened into nothing. Endless darkness. Empty rooms filled with shadows that moved. And behind me, that thing was laughing. Not a human laugh. Not a sound that should come from a throat. It was wrong. Warped. It wasn't chasing me. It didn't have to. The house wouldn't let me leave. I ran. I don't remember deciding to. My body just moved, driven by some primal instinct buried deep in my bones. The walls blurred past me, stretching, shifting, like the house was alive, like it was watching. The air was thick, pressing down on my skin like unseen hands trying to hold me in place. The knocking, God, the knocking. It was everywhere now, echoing to the walls, the floors, the ceiling, like 1,000 fists hammering to be let out. And that thing, the thing wearing my face, was still behind me, not running, just watching, smiling. It didn't have to chase me. The house was doing it for it. I turned a corner and nearly tripped over the rug. The hallway should have ended at the front door. I should have been able to throw it open and run into the cold night air. But the door wasn't there. The hallway just kept going. Longer, darker. A row of doors lined both sides. None of them ones I recognized. I spun, my breath ragged. The thing was still at the end of the hall. Its shadow stretched impossibly long, arms dangling at its sides. Asterisk, where you going? Asterisk. Its voice slithered into my ears, low, layered. Too many voices at once. I turned back and grabbed the closest doorknob, yanking it open. A room. Small. Dusty. Empty. Except for the mirror. The same mirror that had shattered. But here it was whole. And in its surface, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone in the reflection. Behind me, dozens of figures, standing in the shadows, watching. Their faces were wrong, smudged hollow, like the house itself had taken them, like they had been swallowed whole. And I realized they were the ones knocking. They were trapped inside the walls. I turned, a scream caught in my throat, but the room was empty. The only thing there was the sound of my heartbeat, hammering in my ears. Then, asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk, the whisper wasn't in my ears. It was in my head. And the thing at the end of the hall, it was closer, much closer, and it was still smiling. I was trapped. The house had swallowed me whole, bending reality, twisting its halls, stretching time itself. The front door was gone. Every turn led to the same suffocating darkness. The walls pulsed like they were alive, breathing in sync with my own ragged gasps. And the thing, asterisk my reflection, my shadow, my mistake asterisk, stood just a few steps away. Closer now. Too close. I could see the details of its face in the dim, flickering light. My features, but wrong, stretched, unnatural. The skin around its mouth was cracked from the weight of its never-ending grin. It tilted its head, like a predator studying a dying thing. Asterisk, you invited me in. Asterisk. The voice slithered through the air, soft, coaxing. I shook my head violently. I didn't. Asterisk, you read the words. Asterisk, its voice layered, 1,000 whispers beneath my own. Asterisk, you knocked. Asterisk, the air grew heavier. The walls shuddered. The knocking returned, louder this time, more desperate. It was coming from everywhere. Behind the walls, beneath the floors, inside the ceiling. I pressed my hands over my ears. But it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in the house anymore. It was in me. Then, silence. A stillness so absolute that I felt the absence of sound like a physical force. I opened my eyes. The thing was right there. Its breath was ice against my face. Its grin widened. Asterisk, let me show you. Asterisk, it touched me. And suddenly, I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I was inside the walls. I could feel them. Asterisk, the other star. The ones who had come before me. Their hands scraped at the wood. Their fingers bloodied and broken, trying to get out. But there was no out. Only the house. The thing's voice whispered all around me. Asterisk, this is where they stay. Asterisk, I screamed. And then, I was back, lying on the floor, cold, gasping. The hallway was gone. The house was still, empty. The thing was nowhere to be seen. I scrambled to my feet, my body weak, trembling. The air was lighter. The knocking had stopped. Had it let me go? I didn't wait to find out. I ran to the door, the real door back where it was supposed to be, and yanked it open. The night air hit me like a slap. Cold, sharp, real. I stumbled outside, collapsing onto the frozen ground, heaving breaths into the dark sky. The house loomed behind me, silent, still. Then, a single soft knock. From inside. I didn't look back. I ran. Story 2. I should have known better than to take the house. It wasn't that it looked haunted, just old, weathered, the kind of place that had seen better days. A 2-story Victorian tucked away at the end of a quiet street. Its paint was peeling, and the iron gate out front sagged on one hinge. The real estate agent was almost too eager to hand over the keys, rattling off nonsense about vintage charm and historical value. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was just relieved to have found something affordable after the divorce drained my savings. The moving truck pulled away, leaving me alone with a house full of boxes and silence, so deep it felt unnatural. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The wooden floors creaked under my weight, groaning like something waking from a long sleep. The house smelled musty, a mix of old wood and something faintly sour, like damp fabric left too long in a closed-up space. I told myself it was just age. Houses had sense just like people. By evening, I had set up the essentials, mattress on the floor, a few lamps, my laptop, and a cheap coffee maker on the kitchen counter. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone, ignoring the unease that had been creeping up on me since I walked through the door. It was just a house. Just old. That night, the first thing I noticed was a sound. It started around 2 a.m., a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. I lay there in the dark, listening. It was probably the house settling, I told myself. Then the tapping moved, from the far corner of the ceiling to the wall near my bed. I held my breath. The sound stopped. I turned onto my side, pulled the blanket up to my chin. It was just the house. Just the house. I repeated that until I fell asleep. The next morning, I convinced myself that everything I'd heard last night was just my imagination. I had been exhausted from the move, stressed from everything that had led up to it, and sleeping in a strange house for the first time would naturally make me uneasy. I got up early, made a pot of coffee, and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the street. The neighborhood was quiet. A few houses down, an old man in a brown cardigan shuffled down his front steps to retrieve his newspaper. Across the street, a woman walked her dog, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. Everything looked so normal that I almost laughed at myself. I spent most of the day unpacking, arranging furniture, and trying to make the house feel like mine. It wasn't easy. The walls were bare, the ceilings too high, and every time I turned a corner, I expected to see someone standing there, watching me. By late afternoon, I was outside, dragging broken branches to the curb when I noticed a woman standing on the sidewalk, watching me. She was in her mid-50s, wearing a thick gray sweater, her dark hair pulled back into a bun. "You must be the new tenant," she said, offering a polite smile. I wiped my hands on my jeans and nodded. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday." She glanced at the house, her smile faltering slightly. "You know about this place, right?" Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing up at the second-floor windows. "Nothing, really. Just, it's been empty a long time. People don't tend to stay here very long." I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Why not?" She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "There are stories. People say the house is strange." I let out a short laugh, tried to play it off. Every old house has stories. She didn't smile. There was a couple that lived here before. Young, maybe in their early 30s. They didn't even last a month. "What happened?" The woman exhaled, rubbing her arms as if she were suddenly cold. "The wife left first. Took off in the middle of the night, barefoot. Wouldn't come back for her things. Her husband was gone a week later. A neighbor found him standing in the yard in his pajamas, staring up at the house like he was in a trance. When they asked him what was wrong, he just kept saying, 'It knows me now. It knows me.'" A chill ran down my spine. "That's unsettling." She nodded. There were others before them. Not all as dramatic, but none of them stayed. I forced a smile. "Well, I'm not easily scared." The woman gave me a look like she wanted to say more, but changed her mind. "Just be careful." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the late afternoon light, my skin prickling with unease. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. For a while, there was nothing but the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the tapping started again. Soft, deliberate, a rhythmic drumming, as if someone were knocking from inside the walls. I held my breath, counting the beats. 1, 2, 3. A pause. 1, 2, 3. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound moved, traveling across the ceiling, then down the far wall. Then it stopped. I exhaled slowly, my muscles tense. I waited, listening for any other sound, any hint of movement. Nothing. I shook my head, forcing myself to relax. Old pipes, would shifting with the cold, maybe even mice. Houses had their own way of talking, I told myself. Still, it took me a long time to fall asleep. And when I finally did, I dreamed of footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door. The dream felt so real that when I woke up, my heart was already pounding. In the darkness, I could still hear it, the slow, deliberate pacing just outside my bedroom door. My breath hitched, my body frozen as I strained to listen. But as my mind cleared from the fog of sleep, the sound was gone. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it had been a dream, nothing more. But I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to. Morning came sluggishly, gray light seeping through the curtains. I got up feeling groggy, my body stiff from tossing and turning all night. As I moved through the house, a strange feeling lingered, like the air was heavier, thicker, as if I wasn't alone. I shook it off and went about my day, trying to settle into some kind of normal routine. I made breakfast, answered emails, and unpacked the last few boxes. By noon, I was outside, raking dead leaves off the front porch, when I saw him. An old man stood across the street, leaning on a cane, watching me. He was dressed in a faded plaid jacket, his face lined with deep wrinkles. At first, I ignored him, assuming he was just another neighbor curious about the new tenant. But as the minutes passed and he didn't move, unease prickled up my spine. Finally, I raised a hand in a half-hearted wave. He didn't wave back. Instead, he lifted a single finger and pointed at the house. I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile. "Can I help you?" The old man's expression remained blank. Then, in a voice rough as dry leaves, he said, "You should leave." A cold shiver ran through me. "Excuse me?" His gaze never left mine. "This house doesn't want you." I laughed, though the sound came out thin. That's a hell of a welcome to the neighborhood. His expression didn't change. You think I'm joking. I didn't know what to say to that. The old man took a slow step forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. Did you hear it yet? My stomach twisted. Hear what? He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. The knocking, the footsteps. I felt my throat go dry. The old man sighed, shaking his head. You all think it's just the house settling, until it's not. A lump formed in my chest, pressing against my ribs. Who are you? His gaze flickered toward the house again. His face shadowed with something I couldn't quite name. I lived here once. A heavy silence settled between us. The old man took another step back, adjusting his grip on the cane. If you're smart, you'll go now, before it knows you. And with that, he turned and walked away. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner, my pulse thudding in my ears. I want to believe he was just some eccentric old man trying to scare me. I really did. But the way he said it, the certainty in his voice made my skin crawl. That night, I locked every door, every window. I told myself it was just paranoia, just a trick of suggestion. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house was too quiet. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting. At 2 a.m., the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just tapping. It was a full, deliberate knock, 3 times loud and hollow, coming from inside the wall just behind my bed. I sat up so fast my breath caught in my throat. The air in the room had changed, turned sharp and cold. I turned on the lamp, the warm light spilling across the room, but the knocking didn't stop. I threw off the covers and stood, my legs unsteady as I pressed a hand against the wall. Nothing. I knocked back. The house fell silent. My skin prickled as I waited, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, from somewhere down the hall, the floor creaked. Not just the usual old house groan, but the distinct sound of a footstep. My breath hitched. Another step, and another. Slow, heavy, coming closer. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a book from a nightstand, useless, but my fingers tightened around it anyway. The step stopped just outside my door. I stared at the handle, my whole body rigid. The air was thick, charged, like something unseen was just on the other side, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the house fell silent again. Minutes passed. I didn't move, barely breathed. Finally, I forced myself to step forward, hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I swung the door open. The hallway was empty. A sharp exhale left my lungs, my heart hammering. I ran a hand through my hair, swallowing down the panic. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. Had to be. I shut the door, locking it this time, and crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin like a child. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it brought dreams of shadows moving through the house, of whispers curling through the air, of something unseen standing at the foot of my bed. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My body ached, my head was heavy, and a dull pressure sat in my chest. The room was eerily quiet, like the house itself was waiting. For a long time, I just lay there listening. The memory of last night clawed at my thoughts. The knocking, the footsteps outside my door. I want to convince myself that it had been a dream, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed. The air in the house was cold, colder than it should have been. My breath came out in faint puffs as I walked through the hallway, rubbing my arms for warmth. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was wading through something unseen. I checked the locks first. Front door, secure. Back door, locked. Windows, closed. Everything was exactly how I had left it. And yet, the feeling of intrusion lingered. As I stood in the kitchen, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the darkened window, I thought of the old man from yesterday. Did you hear it yet? The knocking. The footsteps. Asterisk, asterisk. I shivered and turned away from the window, trying to shake the unease. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the house was just old and settling in strange ways. I kept myself busy throughout the day, cleaning, rearranging furniture, try and make the space feel like my own. I played music on my phone to drown out the silence, but every now and then I thought I heard something underneath the noise. A soft creak, a distant thump. Each time I froze, waiting. Nothing ever followed. As the sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the walls, I decided to go for a walk. I needed fresh air, something to clear my mind. Outside, the sky was a soft shade of gray, the air crisp with a lingering bite of winter. The street was quiet, the houses dark and still. Most of my neighbors kept to themselves, curtains drawn, porches empty. I passed the house directly next to mine and hesitated. A woman sat on the front steps, bundled in a thick coat, a cigarette dangling between her fingers. She looked to be in her late 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined with years of wear. She caught me staring and lifted her chin in greeting. "You're the new guy." I nodded. "Yeah, just moved in a few days ago." She exhaled a stream of smoke, watching me through narrowed eyes. "And how's it treating you?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "It's quiet." Her lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. For now, a knot tightened in my stomach. "What's that supposed to mean?" She tapped her cigarette, watching the ash fall onto the step below. "Nothing," she muttered. Then, after a pause, she added, "Did the old man across the street talk to you yet?" I nodded. She let out a dry laugh. "Figures. He used to own that house, you know." The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. "He told me he lived there once." "More than once," she corrected. "He moves out, swears he'll never go back. Then a few years later, he's right back inside." She shook her head. "Never stays long, though. A few months at most before he bolts in the middle of the night." A cold chill ran through me. I swallowed hard. "Why?" She flicked her cigarette into the street and stood, brushing ash from her coat. "You'll figure it out." With that, she turned and disappeared inside, leaving me standing there with a creeping sense of unease. That night, the air inside the house felt different, heavier. I kept the hallway light on as I got ready for bed. But even then, the shadows seemed darker than before, stretching unnaturally against the walls. I told myself I was being paranoid. I locked my bedroom door again, pressing my ear against it before stepping back. Silence. Still, I slept with the lamp on. At 3 a.m., I woke with start. Something was breathing in my room. My body went rigid, every muscle locking in place. The sound was soft but steady, slow, deliberate inhales, followed by long, measured exhales. I couldn't move. The air was thick, oppressive, pressing down on my chest. The lamp cast a weak glow across the room, illuminating nothing but empty space. And yet, I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The breathing came from the far corner of the room, near the closet. A shape lurked just beyond the edge of the light, a shadow darker than the rest, a void in the dim glow. It didn't move. Neither did I, for what felt like an eternity. I lay there, trapped in a silent battle of wills. My fingers dug into the blanket, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then, in the quiet, something shifted. The breathing stopped. The shadow in the corner stretched, unfolding, rising. I couldn't look away. The air turned icy, a sharp drop in temperature that sent goosebumps racing across my skin. My breath came out in uneven gasps, every instinct in my body screaming, "Don't move, don't breathe, don't let it know you're awake." But I knew it was too late. A single footstep broke the silence. A slow, deliberate step toward my bed. Then another. The floor creaked under unseen weight, and I felt it. A presence looming over me, just beyond the reach of the lamp's glow. I clenched my jaw so tightly it ached. Something brushed the edge of my blanket, a soft, almost curious touch. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. And then, the lamp flickered. For the briefest moment, the light dimmed, casting the room in near darkness. And in that split second, I saw it. A shape, hunched and wrong, standing inches from my bed. Not a person, not human. The light flared back to life, and the figure was gone. I sat up so fast my vision blurred. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking violently. I scanned the room, my heart pounding against my ribs. The corner was empty. The floor was bare, but the feeling lingered. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I wasn't alone. And whatever was in this house, it was watching, waiting. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning light crept through the blinds, dull and gray, barely warming the chilled air inside the house. I sat on the edge of my bed, rubbing my hands together, trying to shake the feeling of last night. My body felt drained, like I'd run for miles without stopping. My head pounded. My throat was dry. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, that hunched, looming figure just beyond the flickering glow of the lamp. The house was quiet now, almost unnervingly so. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet I felt it, a presence lingering just out of reach, hiding in the shadows, waiting for night to fall again. I told myself I needed to get out, clear my head. Sitting in this place, trapped with my thoughts, would only make things worse. After a quick shower, I threw on a jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and with smoke from somewhere nearby. The street was mostly empty, save for a man walking his dog on the other side of the road. The woman from next door was nowhere to be seen. I walked without direction, trying to put some distance between myself and the house. I passed rows of old houses, their porches sagging, paint peeling from the wood. Most of them looked lived in, but none of them felt welcoming. After about 20 minutes, I found myself in front of a small diner, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. It looked old, like it had been there for decades, a place where the locals gathered, where stories got passed around over coffee and eggs. I hesitated before stepping inside. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee hit me immediately. A handful of people sat at the counter. Others tucked into booths along the walls. The woman behind the counter, a middle-aged waitress with tired eyes, looked up as I entered. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, tossing a towel over her shoulder. I chose a booth near the window, still close enough to hear the quiet hum of conversation from the regulars. The waitress came over a minute later, notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" "Just coffee," I said, my voice rough. She gave me a knowing look, but didn't ask questions. "You got it." As she walked away, I stared down at my hands, turning my cup in slow circles, one she placed in front of me. The heat felt good, grounding me. I wasn't sure how long I sat there before I heard a voice from the next booth over. "You're the new guy, right?" Moved into the old McCarthy place. I looked up. The man speaking was older, maybe in his 60s, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. His hair was thin, mostly gray, and he wore a heavy flannel jacket despite the warmth inside. He had the look of someone who had seen things, someone who knew more than they let on. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's me." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Didn't take long, did it?" My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" The man lifted his coffee cup to his lips, took a slow sip, then set it down. "You wouldn't be sitting here looking like you've seen a ghost if that house was normal." I swallowed hard. "You know about it?" "Everyone in town knows about it," he said. "But most folks don't talk about it. Not anymore." I leaned forward. "Why not?" He sighed, rubbing his hands together as if the memory alone chilled him. "People don't like to remember things that can't be explained. Easier pretend they never happened." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "But you're in the middle of it now, aren't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Something's wrong with that house." He let out a dry laugh. That's putting it lightly. I didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "The man who built that house, William McCarthy, wasn't right in the head," he said. "Back in the early 1900s, he bought that land, put up that house himself, brick by brick. Said it was special, that the land called to him." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man shrugged. "No one knows for sure. Some folks say he was into dark things, occult rituals. Others say he just lost his mind out there, all alone in that big, empty house. What we do know is that after he moved in, things got strange." A chill crept up my spine. Strange how? The man's eyes darkened. People who stayed there never lasted long. Servants ran off in the middle of the night, claiming they heard voices whispering in the walls. A few of them were never seen again. He tapped his fingers against the table. McCarthy himself? Well, one day he just disappeared. My mouth went dry. What do you mean disappeared? Vanished, the man said. No note, no sign of where he went. House was locked up tight, nothing missing. It was like he just stopped existing. I sat back, my pulse pounding. He continued. Over the years, the house passed from one owner to the next. Some stayed a few months. Others barely lasted a week. Almost every single one left in the dead of night, refusing to talk about what happened. He gave me a hard look. You're not the first to sit here looking like you've seen something you can't explain. A heavy silence settled between us. I wanted to tell him about last night, about the breathing in my room, the figure standing in the shadows. But part of me didn't want to say it out loud, like admitting it would make it more real. Instead, I asked, so why does anyone buy it? The man sighed. It gets cheap after a while. Realtors stopped mentioning the history, hoping someone from out of town will take the bait, and they always do. I let out a slow breath. A sharp clang from the kitchen made me jump. I realized my hands were gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. The man studied me for a moment, then leaned in slightly. Whatever you do, don't stay past the first month. A cold sensation ran through me. Why? His expression darkened, because that's when it really starts. I didn't ask what he meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and walked back home. The house loomed in the distance, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, pressing down on me like a weight. I stepped inside and shut the door, locking it behind me. The silence wrapped around me, thick and suffocating. I exhaled slowly, forcing my shoulders to relax. It's just a house, I told myself. Wood and nails. Nothing else. Asterisk, asterisk. I repeated it like a mantra as I walked through rooms, checking every corner, every closet. Nothing out of place. Nothing waiting in the shadows. But as I stood in the hallway, staring at my bedroom door, a familiar sensation crawled up my spine. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was waiting, watching, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew tonight would be worse. The house was silent. Too silent. I stood in the hallway, staring at my bedroom door, my breath coming in slow, measured beats. It was early evening, the last traces of daylight slipping away, and the quiet in the house felt unnatural, like the air was waiting, watching. I swallowed, my throat dry. The man from the diner had planted a seed of fear in me, and no matter how much I tried to brush it off, I couldn't shake his words. Whatever you do, don't stay past the first month. I had been here just over 3 weeks. The thought settled deep in my stomach, like a cold stone. I shook my head and forced myself to move, walking toward the kitchen. Maybe a meal would help. Something warm to drive away the lingering chill that had settled in my bones. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and my body felt light, almost disconnected. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I entered the kitchen. I reached for the overhead light switch and flicked it. Nothing. The bulb didn't even flicker. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. Another broken thing in this godforsaken house. I reached for the drawer, fumbling for the flashlight I'd found when I moved in. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and I pulled it out, clicking it on. A weak yellow beam illuminated the counter, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the room. I tried not to look at them too long. I moved to the fridge, opening it with a low creak. The bulb inside still worked, casting a dull, flickering light over the sparse contents. Half a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, some leftover takeout. I wasn't sure it was still good. My stomach churned at the thought of eating. I settled for pouring a glass of water, taking slow sips as I leaned against the counter, the silence pressing around me, thick and heavy. Then, from somewhere above, a sound, faint, barely audible. A slow, rhythmic creaking. Footsteps. My grip tightened on the glass. The sound was so soft that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Almost. The floor above me creaked again, heavier this time, like someone was shifting their weight. I turned off the flashlight. The kitchen plunged into darkness. My breathing was shallow, controlled. My ears strained, trying to separate normal house noises from something else. Nothing. Then, another step. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I had checked the house before I left that morning. Every door locked, every window shut. There was no way anyone else was inside, unless they had been here the whole time. I stood frozen, my mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. The old man's words from the diner echoed in my head. That's when it really starts. I forced myself to move, setting the glass down carefully, my fingers shaking. I needed a weapon, a knife, something. I reached for the drawer, but before I could open it, a loud thud came from upstairs. I flinched. That wasn't just a creak. That was something falling, or being thrown. My breath hitched, and I backed away from the counter, my mind screaming at me to get out, but my feet didn't listen. Instead, they carried me toward the hallway, toward the stairs. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct told me to turn around, walk out the front door, and never come back. But something was pulling me forward. I hesitated at the base of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. The weak glow from the streetlight outside barely reached the top landing. I took the first step. The wood groaned beneath my weight. Another step. A shiver crawled up my spine, the air growing colder the higher I climbed. By the time I reached the top, my breath was visible in the dim light. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight in one hand as I reached for the bedroom door. It was closed. Had I closed it before I left? I couldn't remember. My fingers brushed against the doorknob, ice cold. I turned it slowly, pushing the door open just an inch, and then it slammed open on its own. I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight flickered, the beam shaking as I swept it across the room. Empty, at least. That's what I told myself. The sheets on my bed were rumpled, the pillow knocked to the floor. My desk chair was turned slightly, like someone had just been sitting there, and on the floor by the closet, a book. I stepped closer, my legs feeling disconnected from my body. The book's cover was faded, the leather cracked with age. I knelt down, hesitating before picking it up. The spine creaked as I flipped it open. The pages were filled with dense, handwritten text. The ink faded in places but still legible. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, like the writer had been in a rush or in fear. I flipped to the first page. August 3rd, 1912. I fear I have made a terrible mistake. A chill ran through me. I turned the page, my eyes scanning the words. Asterisk, the rituals were never meant to go this far. I thought I could control it. I was wrong. The house is no longer mine. Asterisk. A sharp creak behind me made my blood run cold. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The closet door. It was open. I was sure it had been closed before. The air inside the closet was impossibly dark, the shadows seeming to stretch and pulse. And then, a whisper, low, breathy, just behind my ear. I spun again, my back slamming against the closet door. My flashlight flickered violently, and for a split second, I saw something. A shape, tall, wrong, not human. The light died completely. The darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't breathe. A pressure settled over my chest, heavy and suffocating. My fingers dug into the floor, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The whisper came again, curling around me like smoke. Not words, just a sound. And then, a hand. I felt it, cold fingers pressing against my arm, creeping up toward my throat. Something was in the room with me. I fought against the paralysis gripping my body, my mind screaming at me to move. With everything I had, I shoved myself backward, crashing through the closet door. I hit the floor hard, gasping for air. The moment I was out of the room, the pressure lifted. The flashlight flickered back to life. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding as I aimed the beam back into my bedroom. Empty. The closet door hung open, motionless. The book lay at my feet, open to a page near the middle. Asterisk, it watches from the dark. It waits for nightfall. Asterisk. My vision blurred. My pulse roared in my ears. I couldn't stay here. I wouldn't stay here. I grabbed my keys and ran. Out of the room, down the stairs, through the front door. I didn't stop until I was in my car, hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I sped down the street, away from the house, away from whatever had been in that room with me. But even as I drove, something gnawed at the edge of my mind. A whisper, a presence, something I had woken up. And I knew, deep down in the marrow of my bones, it wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't stop driving until I reached the outskirts of town. My hands were locked around the steering wheel, fingers stiff and trembling. The road ahead was empty, lit only by the cold glow of my headlights cutting through the night. I had no plan, no destination, just an overwhelming need to get as far away from that house as possible. But even as I drove, I could still feel it. That presence. It was as if something had followed me, lingering in the space just beyond my vision, just beyond my reach. The feeling of unseen eyes pressing against my skin made my breath uneven, my chest tight. I pulled into an empty gas station, parking beneath the dim fluorescent lights. The place looked deserted. The single street lamp buzzed softly, casting long, stretched-out shadows across the cracked pavement. I killed the engine and let my head drop against the steering wheel, sucking in a deep breath. What the hell had just happened? I had tried, I really had, to be rational about all of this. I had told myself the sounds were just the house settling. The cold spots a draft, the whispers a trick of my imagination. But after the night, there was no denying it anymore. Something was in that house, and I had been stupid enough to wake it up. I sat there for a while, the ticking of the cooling engine, the only sound in the still night. My mind kept circling back to the book, the frantic scrawls of the man who had lived there before me. Asterisk, I thought I could control it. I was wrong. The house is no longer mine. Asterisk. His words had the ring of truth to them. I should have left that damn book where it was. With a sigh, I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out my phone. The screen lit up, showing a handful of missed calls from my boss, from an unknown number, from a neighbor I had barely spoken to. No messages, no voicemails. I stared at the screen, debating whether to call someone to tell them what had happened. But what would I even say? That my house was haunted? That I had been chased out of my own bedroom by something I couldn't see? They'd think I was losing it. Hell, maybe I was. I ran a hand over my face, my skin clammy. I needed to think. I needed a plan. I couldn't just keep running. With reluctant hands, I typed in a search for the house's history. At first, nothing came up. Just old real estate listings, a few mentions in town records. But then, buried deep in a forum about local legends, I found it. The Blackwood House. That was the name the locals had given it. I clicked on the thread. A few posts from years ago. Some from people who had lived in town their whole lives. Others from visitors who had heard things. Stories. No one stays there for more than a few months. Asterisk, it's cursed. You can feel it the second you step inside. Asterisk. Whatever you do, don't sleep with the closet door open. My stomach twisted. I scrolled further, my eyes catching on one post in particular. A woman named Margaret had written it nearly a decade ago. Asterisk, my brother lived there back in the 90s. He lasted 2 months before he ran in the middle of the night, swearing something was following him. He wouldn't talk about what happened, but he never set foot in that house again. He used to say he could still hear it, even after he left. Asterisk. I shivered. I could still hear it too. The whispers, the creaks, the low, steady sound of something shifting in the dark. I exhaled shakily, gripping my phone tighter. I needed answers. Margaret had included an email address. I hesitated only a moment before sending her a message. I need to talk to you about the house. Please, if you see this, reach out. Asterisk, asterisk. I wasn't sure if she'd respond, or if I even wanted her to. The clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. I had been sitting here for nearly an hour, and I was no closer to figuring out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I rubbed my temples. I couldn't stay in my car all night, but the thought of going back to the house made my stomach lurch. I needed a motel, somewhere far from Blackwood Street. With that decision made, I put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot, heading for the highway. I drove for another 20 minutes before I found a place, a cheap, run-down motel off the main road. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly red glow over the parking lot. I checked in without much thought, barely listening as the night clerk handed me my key. My mind was still tangled in the events of the night, still hearing the creaks, the whispers. The door in my room was stiff, the lock old and rusted. It took some effort, but I finally got it open, stepping inside the dimly lit space. The bed was lumpy, the carpet stained. The bathroom door didn't quite close all the way, but none of that mattered, as long as I was away from that house. I didn't care. I dropped onto the bed, exhaustion pulling at me, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that open closet door, the shape standing in the dark. I turned onto my side, staring at the wall, forcing myself to breathe slowly, deeply. Then, a soft creak. My body went rigid. No, that wasn't possible. I was miles away from that house. Another creak, closer this time. I sat up, my breath trapped in my chest. The room was dark, but I could see just enough in the faint glow of the motel sign filtering through the curtains. Nothing was there. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, in the silence, a whisper right next to my ear. I spun, grabbing for the lamp on the nightstand, fumbling for the switch. The bulb flared to life, bathing the room in weak yellow light. Nothing. The room was empty. My pulse roared in my ears. I was losing my mind. But then I saw it. The closet door. It was open, just a crack. I stared at it, my throat tight. I was sure, absolutely asterisk sure, I hadn't touched that door when I came in. I stood slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But I didn't. I took a step forward, then another. The air was thick, heavy. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. A pause, a breath, then, just as my fingers brushed the wood, the door slammed shut. I stumbled back, heart hammering, my mouth dry. The whisper came again, soft and taunting, and I knew I had left the house, but it had come with me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, my back pressed against the cheap wooden headboard, eyes locked onto the closet door. It remained shut, but that didn't make me feel any safer. I kept expecting it to creak open again, expecting something to step out from the shadows inside. But nothing did. The only sound in the room was my own unsteady breathing. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that the fear, the exhaustion, the paranoia, I was letting them get to me. I had barely eaten, barely slept, and my mind was slipping into places it shouldn't. That explanation would have been easier to accept if I hadn't heard the whisper, if I hadn't felt the breath on my skin, like something had been leaning over my shoulder. I checked my phone again. No response from Margaret. The message was still marked as sent, but not read. I needed to do something. I needed to get answers. Morning came sluggishly, the pale light of dawn creeping through the curtains. I was still awake, still stiff and sore from sitting in the same position all night. The world outside carried on as if nothing had happened. Birds chirped. A car engine rumbled to life somewhere in the distance. I forced myself to stand, my legs numb. A shower, food, coffee, something normal. I told myself if I could just act normal, maybe my mind would settle. The shower was barely lukewarm, and the water pressure was pathetic, but I stayed under the stream longer than I needed to. I didn't want to step out, didn't want to be alone with my thoughts again. By the time I was dressed and leaving the motel, the morning air had a crisp bite to it. The weight in my chest hadn't eased, but I told myself I'd figure things out. I drove into town, stopping at a small diner just off the main street. The place was nearly empty, save for a few older locals sipping coffee and reading newspapers. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, Pour me a cup without asking. You look like hell, she said, setting the pot back on the counter. I let out a humorless chuckle. Yeah, long night. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, she slid a menu toward me. Coffee's on the house. You need something to eat? I nodded, ordering something simple. Toast, eggs, bacon, food I could stomach. The coffee was hot and bitter, but I drank it anyway, letting it settle into my bones. It wasn't much, but it grounded me, made me feel a little more human. I pulled out my phone, checking my email again. Still nothing. Margaret wasn't going to respond. Maybe she thought I was some lunatic digging up old ghost stories. Maybe she didn't want to relive whatever had happened to her brother. But I couldn't let it go. I had to find her. I took a deep breath, then typed her name into a search. A few results popped up: an old Facebook account, a LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in years, and, finally, a listing in a local directory. She was still in town. I hesitated. Showing up at a stranger's house unannounced wasn't exactly the best way to get answers, but I didn't have time to wait. After finishing my meal, I left the 20 on the counter and got back in my car, punching her address into my GPS. The drive took me to the far edge of town, where the houses were smaller, older. Margaret's place was a modest one-story home with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. A wind chime dangled from the awning, barely swaying in the still air. I stepped out of the car, my stomach twisting. This was a bad idea, but I knocked on the door anyway. Silence. Then the sound of shuffling from inside. The door cracked open, just enough for me to see a sliver of a woman's face. She was older than I'd expected, maybe mid-60s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that studied me with thinly veiled suspicion. Can I help you? I swallowed hard. Are you Margaret? Her eyes narrowed. Who's asking? My name is... I hesitated, suddenly realizing how insane this was going to sound. I sent you an email last night about the house, the one your brother lived in. Her expression hardened. The door didn't open any further. I don't talk about that, she said flatly. Please, I said, taking a step closer. I need to know what happened. I think, my voice faltered, I think whatever was in that house is still there, and I think it's after me. Margaret let out a slow breath. For a moment, I thought she was going to shut the door in my face. But then, reluctantly, she stepped back and motioned for me to come inside. The house smelled like old wood and dust. The living room was small, cluttered with books and framed photographs. She gestured for me to sit while she settled into a worn armchair across from me. You're living in that house? She asked, her voice quieter now. Not anymore, I admitted. I left last night. She nodded slowly. Good. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Your brother. What happened to him? Margaret sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. He never told me everything, just bits and pieces. But I know it was bad, worse than what he let on. I waited, not wanting to push too hard. He said it started small, she continued. Noises at night, cold spots, things moving on their own. He thought he was imagining it at first, but then she trailed off. Then what? Her lips pressed into a thin line. He woke up one night to find the closet door open. Said he could hear breathing inside, like something was just standing there, waiting for him to move. My stomach turned. He moved out the next day, she said. Didn't even take half his stuff. He just left. And even after he was gone, he wasn't right. He never talked about it. Never went near that street again. And sometimes... She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night, swearing it had followed him. The word sent a cold shiver down my spine. I think it followed me too. I admitted. Margaret's gaze met mine, something dark and knowing in her expression. You need to get rid of it, she said. I swallowed hard. How? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and disappeared down the hall. A few minutes later, she returned with something in her hands. A book, a familiar one. My breath caught. It was the same journal I had found in my house. I shook my head. I thought this was left behind by the last owner. Margaret sat back down, placing the book between us. It was, she said, but my brother found it first. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Read it carefully, she warned. There's more in there than you realize. And if you want to survive this, you need to understand what you're dealing with. I hesitated before picking it up. The pages felt heavy in my hands. Something told me once I started reading, there would be no going back. I sat there, staring at the journal, my hands resting on the worn leather cover. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just words. Margaret watched me carefully, her expression unreadable. The silence between us stretched thick and heavy, until finally she spoke. You don't have to read it. Her voice was quiet but firm. But if you do, you need to be ready for what comes next. I swallowed hard. My fingers tightened around the book. What do you mean? I asked. Margaret sighed, leaning back in her chair. Whatever is in that house, it doesn't like to be known. The more you understand it, the more you acknowledge it, the closer it gets. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I should have walked away right then. I should have handed the book back, thanked her for her time, and left. But I didn't. Instead, I opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded but still legible. The handwriting was neat, precise, as if the writer had taken their time crafting each word. I started reading. At first, it was just notes, observations about the house, about its structure, its history. The previous owner, Richard Wells, had been meticulous in documenting everything. He wrote about renovations, strange architectural quirks, even the weather on certain days. But then, halfway through, the tone changed. The sentences became shorter, more frantic. March 3rd. The tapping started again last night. It always comes from the closet. I checked inside, nothing there. But the moment I turn away, I swear I hear it move. March 5th. It's getting bolder. Noises in the walls. Breathing when I sleep. The shadows shift when I'm not looking. I tried staying up all night, but it doesn't matter. It waits. March 7th. I found footprints in the dust. They weren't mine. They led from the closet to my bed. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. March 10th. I made a mistake. I tried speaking to it, asked what it wanted. The room went silent. Then it whispered back. You know me. The word sent a cold, creeping sensation through my body. I looked up at Margaret, my breath unsteady. Did your brother... I started, my voice barely above a whisper. Did he ever mention hearing voices? Margaret's face darkened. She nodded. He wouldn't tell me what they said, only that they knew his name. A sickening weight settled in my chest. I turned back to the journal. The final pages were smeared with ink, as if the writer's hands had been shaking too much to hold the pen steady. March 12th. I can't leave. Every time I try, something stops me. The doors won't open. The windows won't break. I hear it breathing in my ear. It's always behind me now. Watching. Waiting. March 14th. I don't think I was ever alone here. I think it's been with me since the beginning. Maybe even before. The final entry was scrawled hastily. The ink smudged as if the writer had been interrupted. March 15th. If you're reading this, it knows you now. The book slipped from my hands, landing on the floor with a dull thud. A cold silence filled the room. Margaret didn't move. I need to go, I said, my voice barely steady. She nodded. Be careful. I left without another word. The drive back to the motel felt longer than before. The air felt thicker, like something unseen was pressing around me. I parked in the lot, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The journal's words burned in my mind. If you're reading this, it knows you now. I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths. Maybe I was letting the paranoia get to me. Maybe this was just my mind twisting coincidences into something worse. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I got out of the car and headed into my room. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was different, heavier, like someone had been here while I was gone. The curtains were drawn, just as I had left them. The bed was still unmade, the chair in the corner untouched. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet I knew. I checked the closet first. My fingers hesitated on the handle before I yanked it open. Empty. I let out a breath, but it didn't ease the tension in my chest. Then I noticed something. The mirror above the sink. The reflection wasn't quite right. I took a slow step closer, my pulse hammering. The room behind me looked the same. Bed, chair, desk. But my reflection, it wasn't moving in sync with me. I froze. A chill crawled up my spine as I lifted a hand. The reflection hesitated for a fraction of a second before copying the movement. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back. The reflection didn't. It smiled. A slow, unnatural stretch of lips that didn't belong to me. I stumbled away, my back hitting the dresser. My mind screamed at me to look away, to run, but I couldn't move. Then the light flickered, and the reflection stepped forward. That was enough. I grabbed my bag, not bothering to check if I had everything. My hands fumbled with the door handle, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. Finally, the door yanked open, and I stumbled into the night air. I didn't stop. I ran to my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. The motel room door remained open, the darkness inside stretching deeper than it should. I refused to look in the rear view mirror. I started the engine, my hands trembling as I pulled out of the lot. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't go back to the house. But as I drove, my pulse pounding my ears, I realized something. I had no idea where to go. And somewhere deep in my mind, a thought whispered, "It knows you now." I drove for miles without a destination. The headlights of my car sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the empty road ahead. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel, my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, afraid I'd see something that wasn't supposed to be there. The reflection in the motel room had shattered whatever thin barrier of disbelief I had left. Something was watching me. Something was following me. I gritted my teeth and pressed down on the accelerator. The town disappeared behind me, swallowed by the night, but the unease remained. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to focus. Where could I go? Who could I turn to? Margaret? No. If what she said was true, the more I acknowledged this thing, the closer it got. But I'd already crossed that line, hadn't I? The moment I opened that journal, the moment I read those words, it knew me now. A sign appeared in the glow of my headlights. Rest stop 1 mile ahead. I needed to breathe, to think. I pulled into the rest stop, parking under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp. The place was deserted, just an old vending machine, a couple of wooden picnic tables, and a small building with restrooms. I killed the engine and exhaled, rubbing my temples. I needed to get my head straight. Maybe I was spiraling, letting fear turn coincidences into something worse. Maybe a tap, soft, deliberate, right on the driver's side window. I went rigid. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I forced myself to look. Nothing. The lot was empty. No cars. No people. Just the quiet hum of the street lamp above. I swallowed hard, pulse hammering. I must have imagined it. Then, tap. The sound came from the passenger side now. My breath hitched. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone, the screen casting a faint glow in the darkness. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the window. Still nothing. I exhaled sharply, trying to slow my racing heart. I had to be losing it. The exhaustion, the fear, it was messing with my head. I reached for the ignition. I needed to keep moving. Then the radio turned on. Static, loud, violent. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs as the speakers crackled. The volume climbed higher, a deafening roar of white noise that filled the car. I fumbled with the dial, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't budge. A voice cut through the static. Low, garbled. It spoke my name. The temperature in the car dropped. My breath came out in a visible puff, my hands numb against the dashboard. I slammed my palm against the radio. The voice laughed. Not from the speakers. From the back seat. I didn't think. I just moved. My hand shot to the door handle, yanking it open as I stumbled out onto the pavement. My phone clattered to the ground, its light flickering across the empty lot. My chest heaved, my legs unsteady beneath me. The car was still running, the radio hissing. The back seat was empty, but the rear view mirror, a shadow sat there, watching. I turned and ran. The cold night air burned in my lungs as I sprinted toward the restroom building. I didn't care how ridiculous it was. I just needed to be somewhere, anywhere, other than that car. I shoved open the door and stumbled inside, bracing myself against the sink. I gripped the porcelain, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I looked pale, eyes wide, pupils blown. Sweat clung to my forehead despite the cold. I turned the faucet, splashing water on my face, trying to steady my breath. It was inside the car. It had spoken my name. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't stress or exhaustion. Something was with me. I squeezed my eyes shut. Think. A whisper slithered through the silence. Close, right against my ear. I snapped my head up. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It looked like me. Same face, same clothes, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep, and it was smiling. I stumbled backward, knocking into the stall door behind me. The thing in the mirror tilted its head, watching me, studying me. Then slowly, it raised a hand. I didn't. The hand pressed against the glass, the fingers long, unnatural. The smile widened, stretching past the boundaries of my own mouth. I choked on a breath. Then it whispered, "You brought me with you." The lights flickered. A deep, suffocating pressure filled the room, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The air thickened, heavy with something unseen. The mirror cracked. A jagged line split down the center, spiderwebbing outward. The reflection's smile didn't falter. I turned and ran. The door slammed behind me as I bolted into the night. I didn't stop until I reached my car, wrenching the door open and throwing myself inside. The engine was still running. The radio was silent. The back seat was empty. I didn't check the mirror. I hit the gas, peeling out a lot and back onto the highway. The darkness swallowed the road ahead, endless and unyielding. My hand shook on the wheel, my knuckles white. I had to end this. I had to go back to the house. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. Maybe nothing could be done. Maybe I'd already sealed my fate. But I couldn't keep running. The house had answers. And if I wanted to survive, I needed to find them. But as I drove, something gnawed at the edge of my thoughts. A memory. The last page of the journal. If you're reading this, it knows you now. I exhaled shakily, gripping the wheel tighter. I wasn't just going back to the house. I was going back to it. And it was waiting. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a dark ribbon cutting through the silent night. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The headlights illuminated only what was directly in front of me, the trees on either side standing like silent sentinels. The rest stop was far behind me now, but the fear clung to me like a second skin. I hadn't checked the rear view mirror since I left. I wouldn't. My heart thudded in my chest as I approached the turnoff leading back to the house. My house. The cursed house. My pulse quickened at the thought of stepping foot inside again, but I had no choice. If I wanted to end this, I had to go back. The tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled into the driveway. The house loomed in front of me, dark and still. A single porch light flickered weakly, barely holding back the oppressive blackness that surrounded it. I sat in the car, the engine idling, listening. Silence. Not the normal kind of nighttime silence. The absence of everything. No rustling leaves. No chirping insects. Just a hollow, suffocating void. I swallowed hard and turned off the ignition. The engine's low hum died, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. The house was waiting. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. My breath curled in the cold air as I approached the porch. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if something unseen pressed against my chest, resisting my return. I reached the front door and hesitated. My fingers hovered over the handle. Then, a creak from inside. The house was supposed to be empty. I sucked in a breath, forcing my hand to move. The doorknob was ice cold as I turned it, the latch clicking softly. The door swung inward with a groan, revealing the dark interior. I stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. The floorboards whispered under my weight as I moved forward, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The living room was just as I had left it. The couch, the coffee table, the dim lamp in the corner, everything was the same. And yet, nothing felt right. I moved cautiously, my ears straining for any sound. The house felt occupied, as if it had been waiting for me to return. A soft thump sounded from upstairs. I stiffened, my heart pounding. Something was up there. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. I had come here for answers. And the only place I hadn't searched thoroughly was the attic. I turned toward the staircase. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed, each one stretching the silence thinner, threatening to snap. The hallway at the top was even darker, the light from the street barely reaching this far. My bedroom door stood slightly ajar, the edges lost in shadow. But I wasn't going there. The attic. I moved past the other rooms until I reached the pull-down ladder. I hesitated, then reached up and grabbed a string. With a low creak, the stairs unfolded, leading into the darkness above. A rush of cold air spilled down. I hesitated only a moment before climbing. The attic smelled of old wood, dust, and something damp. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows as I scanned the space. Boxes, old furniture draped in white sheets. Cobwebs stretched across the beams like skeletal fingers. Then I saw it, a trunk. It sat alone near the far wall. Its dark wood polished despite the layer of dust around it. I moved toward it, my breath shallow. My hands trembled as I knelt and brushed away the dust from the lid. The latch was rusted but not locked. I hesitated, then lifted it. The inside was lined with faded velvet. A few books, some photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. My chest tightened. Another journal. I picked it up, my fingers tingling as I flipped open the brittle pages. The handwriting was elegant, precise. December 4th, 1921. Asterisk that speaks to me now. In the quiet hours, when the house breathes, I hear it whisper my name. I should not have performed the ritual, but I was desperate, and now it will not leave me. Asterisk. I swallowed, turning the page. December 12th, 1921. Asterisk, I've sealed the door, but I fear it is not enough. The whispers grow louder. The mirror no longer shows only my reflection. If you are reading this, then it knows you too. Asterisk. A chill ran down my spine. The mirror. I turned the page, but the rest of the entries were smudged, unreadable. Something creaked behind me. I froze. A shift in the air, a presence, then a voice. Soft, right behind me. You shouldn't have come back. I spun, my flashlight shaking. Nothing. Just shadows. Just the empty attic. But the air felt thick, suffocating. I stumbled back, the journal clutched in my hands, and scrambled down the attic ladder. My foot slipped on the last rung, and I landed hard on the wooden floor below. Pain shot my leg, but I barely registered it. I had to get out. I lurched toward the stairs, but as I passed the hallway mirror, something made me stop. I didn't want to look, but I did. My reflection stood there, but it wasn't me. The same face, the same clothes, but the eyes, black voids, and the mouth, it was smiling, a slow, stretching grin that didn't belong to me. My breath caught in my throat. My reflection lifted a hand and waved. A whisper slithered through the silence. It's too late. The lights flickered. The house groaned. And then the reflection stepped out of the mirror. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. My body screamed at me to move faster, but the house seemed to stretch, warping around me. The front door was so far away, too far. The air behind me shifted. Cold fingers grazed the back of my neck. I threw myself at the door, twisting the knob, yanking it open. The night air hit me like a slap as I stumbled onto the porch. But I didn't stop. I ran to the car, fumbling for my keys. My hand shook violently as I shoved the key into the ignition and turned. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, tires screeching against the gravel. My breath was ragged, my vision blurred with panic as I tore down the driveway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The house shrank in the distance, disappearing into the darkness. But the feeling didn't fade. The cold lingered. The whisper echoed in my ears. And in the rear-view mirror, a shadow sat in the back seat, watching. The night swallowed the road as I sped away from the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my hands trembling so violently I could barely keep control of the car. The whisper still echoed in my ears, wrapping around my thoughts like tendrils of cold mist. It's too late. The voice had been right behind me, right in my ear. And I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the presence in the back seat, watching. I refused to look in the rear view mirror. I wouldn't give it that power. But the air inside the car had changed. Thicker, heavier, pressing it against my chest like invisible hands. The temperature had dropped, my breath turning to mist in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. I had to keep moving. I had to get as far away as possible. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, the engine groaning in protest as the speedometer climbed. Trees blurred past, shadows shifting unnaturally at the edges of my vision. My mind raced through everything I had read in the journal. The whispers, the mirror, the warning about the ritual. Had the house's original owner brought something into this world? And if he had I set it free by returning? I couldn't think about it now. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. The town wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes away if I kept up the speed. But the road ahead stretched into darkness, the streetlights flickering in and out like dying fireflies. And then the first sign of something wrong. The radio crackled. I hadn't turned it on. Static filled the car, a deep, vibrating hum that set my teeth on edge. The sound warped, bending in strange, unnatural ways, like voices buried beneath layers of white noise. Then, beneath the static, I heard it. My name, a whisper, stretching and distorting to the speakers. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. "You're not real," I muttered through clenched teeth. Laughter, soft, almost amused. Then the static stopped. Silence. I exhaled shakily, forcing my gaze to stay fixed on the road. But then, a flicker in the mirror. I didn't want to look, but my eyes betrayed me. A shape, a shadow sitting in the back seat, barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard. Not moving, just watching. A jolt of pure terror shot through me. My pulse pounded in my ears as my hands tightened on the wheel, my knuckles aching from the pressure. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as I pushed the car past its limit. The town. I just needed to reach the town. The streetlights grew brighter, houses appearing in the distance. Safety, civilization, people. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the lights ahead, the promise of escape. But then, the whisper came again. "You can't outrun me." A breath on my neck. Ice cold. The car swerved. I barely corrected in time, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I nearly lost control. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my entire body shaking. I wasn't imagining this. It was real. I reached the first street of town, the streetlights glaring down in contrast to the endless dark of the road behind me. I didn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Not yet. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, tires screeching as I threw the car into park. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their artificial glow spilling onto the cracked pavement. I turned off the engine, my breath coming fast and shallow. Silence. I hesitated. Slowly I turned. The back seat was empty. Nothing but darkness and the faint reflection of my own pale, terrified face in the window. My heart hammered against my ribs. Had I imagined it? I reached for the door handle, ready to get out, to step into the safety of the gas station's harsh fluorescent glow. But just as my fingers brushed the handle, asterisk tap, 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 asterisk. A knock from inside the car, right behind my seat. I choked on my own breath, whipping around. The back seat was still empty, but my stomach twisted into knots, the air around me pressing down like a suffocating weight. The knock had been real. Something had been there. I fumbled with the door handle, shoving the door open and stumbling onto the pavement. The cold air hit me, and I inhaled deep, ragged breaths. My hands shook as I slammed the door shut behind me. The gas station was empty except for the attendant inside, a bored-looking man in his 50s flipping through a magazine behind the counter. I forced myself forward, my legs weak beneath me. I pushed open the glass door, the bell above jingling softly. The attendant barely glanced up. "You okay, buddy?" he muttered, still focused on his magazine. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just needed to stop for a second." My voice sounded thin, distant. I moved toward the counter, my mind scrambling for something, anything, to ground me. The man finally looked up, his brow furrowed as he studied my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I let out a weak, humorless laugh. Something like that. He tilted his head slightly, then leaned forward on the counter. "You from around here?" I shook my head. He nodded slowly. "That your car out there?" I stiffened. "Yeah. Why?" His expression darkened. He hesitated, as if choosing his next words carefully. "You came from the old house, didn't you?" A shiver crawled up my spine. I swallowed hard. "How do you know?" The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because you're not the first one to come through here looking like that." My blood turned to ice. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "That place ain't just an old house. It's got history, bad history. People don't stay long. And the ones that do..." He hesitated. "They don't leave the same." My pulse pounded in my ears. The man who owned it before, he wrote about a ritual, about something in the house. The attendant's face darkened further. "Yeah, that'd be Alexander Roth." The name sent a fresh chill through me. "He messed with things he shouldn't have," the man continued. "Things that don't stay buried." I opened my mouth to ask more, but a sound stopped me. The soft chime of the bell. The door had opened, but no one had come in. The air inside the gas station grew heavy. The fluorescent lights flickered. And then behind me, a whisper. "Asterisk, I told you. It's too late." Asterisk. The mirror behind the counter reflected something standing just behind me. Something tall. Something smiling. My breath froze in my chest. The attendant's face drained of color. He backed away, his hands trembling. "Son," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You need to run." I turned, and the lights went out.